All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for February 6, 2023. We've got lots and lots to get through. But before I go any further, I just want to welcome everyone. This is a Kubernetes community meeting. We abide by the same code of conduct as the rest of the community. Largely just means be nice to each other. Yeah, very straightforward. This agenda, I hope everyone has a link to it. If you don't, I'll drop it in chat. Anyone should feel welcome to add things to the agenda at any point or drop something in chat, whatever's easiest, and we'll try and get to it. But with that, I think the first thing we have on the agenda is this egress discussion. And Philip, I think I see you on the call. Maybe you can provide a little bit of background about this.
Sure. Yeah. So sort of how we got here. So I'm a product manager at F5, and I focus on communication service provider stuff. And we really have, we've built a product that's really about how to make Kubernetes work better for service providers, primarily for like launching 5G. So, service providers for the first time, like mobile telephone companies, let's call them, for the first time, they're really trying to move into using cloud native practices. And of course, Kubernetes is sort of the main tool for that. And so I'm coming at it very much from a, sort of where are the gaps in Kubernetes networking that make it difficult for these telcos to launch 5G or other, kinds of what we call network functions. At F5, we also have, other folks like the Nginx guys, who have sort of a broader remit and are working more, with the enterprises and stuff. I wrote this egress thing primarily from the service provider kind of telco point of view, because this is one of the biggest gaps that we've uncovered. And I can go into the gaps more generally, and I think I kind of put some of it into the document. But, telcos in general, they're very sensitive to things that are below layer 7, like IP addresses and, different protocols. They use a lot of like ICMP and UDP and SCTP and diameter and protocols that are not regularly used. And so I kind of laid out there the major problems that they face around that are related to egress. And if you where the numbering starts. And essentially, one of the problems is that the applications that these service providers are launching are networking applications. And there is, some legacy aspect to it and some just sort of, just by the nature of being a networking application matters. So for example, IP addressing is really important. It can take 6 weeks of IP engineering to determine what IP addresses to use for a new network element that's being introduced. And so, having the correct IP address as the source for traffic as it egresses is super important. So one of the key use cases that we implement is what we call egress snat, where egressing traffic gets snatted to well-known IP addresses for that network function. And we do it on a namespace by namespace basis. And that seems to be working for the telcos. It also, one of the other issues is that their network functions aren't sort of just a bunch of APIs. They're really kind of meant to be like a singular network function that both calls out and receives. And so having the traffic go through the same logical elements like a gateway is helpful. I mean, part of it's for things like coordinating IP addresses, like I said before. Part of it's also for like just coordinating policies that you're going to apply, and you want it to be consistent for ingressing and egressing traffic, and not have two totally separate network paths. And then there's some sort of more kind of edgy cases around IPv4 v6 translation, and then just the fact that the telcos have very complex networks outside of, and network domains outside of the cluster. So a cluster, you may have traffic that's egressing toward several different domains that aren't routable to each other, and that have to pass through different firewalls. So we actually apply like source NAT addressing based on the destination that you're headed to in the network domain. I think, and so I talked in here a little bit also about our implementation, not so much because I'm recommending that that's the way everybody has to do it, but to kind of just to help illustrate some of the pain points that we ran into while trying to implement egress controls, like how to coordinate with the CNI, because generally the CNI is, sort of determining what's happening with egressing traffic. And we went through a couple of different iterations on that, where we either did custom development with the CNI, so like with Red Hat, with their OVN Kubernetes that they include with OpenShift, they did some sort of custom logic with us that they're going to now be GAing as a feature called multiple external gateways. And we were looking at whether we wanted to modify like Calico, and how we wanted to do this, if we wanted to do it on a CNI per CNI basis. And we've been working on a couple of strategies that we call CNI independence, to try and sort of shortcut the CNI to funnel egress traffic toward the right gateway. And I kind of explained some of that in the form, or further down in the doc.
Yeah, this is really great. Thank you for writing this up and getting the conversation started. It is helpful to see how you're using this, how you're implementing egress today. I think one of my questions here is how do you, I guess, how do you see this? I think many of us have seen that gateway and egress seems inevitable, but for your specific use cases, do you have any idea of how that could work with Gateway API? And I know you've said it's pretty close, but
I would think that you would implement an egress route, egress routes, and I think probably you wouldn't necessarily make it a mandatory part of the, there are the whatever 3 levels, right? There's the mandatory, the optional, and the custom. I think you'd make it, optional stuff, because probably, a lot of gateways don't, are not that interested in egress, and there is some additional trouble in it. But I would leave the particulars to how you get the traffic maybe up to the implementation, because like we're looking at doing it with service mesh. We also have this sort of mini CNI that can sort of shortcut traffic that's going to egress, and funnel all the non-egressing traffic toward the primary CNI, Calico or whatever, but send the egressing traffic toward our gateway. I think there are a lot of different ways to skin that cat, so I don't know that we should specify how that works, but I think that the model would be like egress routes that would be analogous to the kind of ingress type routes that we've been doing.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I agree. We shouldn't get too far down into the weeds of how it would be implemented, just the problems we're trying to solve. It sounds like the problems that you're trying to solve are, fairly low level. It seems like you're primarily focused on IP routing. Is that correct? Not so much.
I was
like,
actually going to ask, yeah, do you see a role here for layers above 3 and 4?
Yes. So I think it's a little bit analogous to like, so part of it is just getting the traffic to the same gateway, right? And then, just like with TCP route, you don't have to specify the IP addresses directly. Like, you can have some more custom work there once the traffic is going to the same gateway. But like, again, for policies, one of the things we're very interested in doing is expanding how you do policies, and having, like, we're implementing firewall and application firewall and other kinds of policies on top of our routes. And so, for egress, I'd like to be able to do, a lot of our customers, let me put it this way, a lot of our customers want to collapse their firewall infrastructure down closer to their applications. And so right now, if you have a cluster that has, various network functions running in it, all of the firewalls that are around it have to be configured for each of those applications. And again, for each different network domain, blah, 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 blah. And it's very hard to do that stuff using like Kubernetes network policies. Guy from Verizon, I just got off a call from the guy from Verizon who said, use some salty language about trying to do it with Kubernetes network policies, right? But if you can funnel it all through the gateway, you can apply consistent policies on either L4 type firewalls like ACLs and applications, but also application firewalls where you are, checking maybe the API both directions. But yeah, absolutely, more than just the snap thing is the single highest priority, but then having it in a consistent place to apply consistent policy is probably the second highest.
And actually, there is scope for, at least from my perspective, there is scope for this to venture into the HTTP land as well. Knowing, at which point, like in the classic ICAP days of old, right? There's a pre-cache filter, post-cache filter, a pre-cache request, post-cache request, pre-cache response, post-cache response, hooks for applying security policies. Like this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think there is scope for many of those things to be applicable via egress policies as well. And having a distinct egress ingress route allows us to make that distinction.
It almost feels like you end up, or maybe I'm misinterpreting this, but it almost sounds like you're thinking about the possibility of an HTTP egress route distinct from an HTTP route. Am I hearing that correctly?
Well, we haven't explored it that far, but that is something along the lines of what I was thinking of, at least at this time, given the data we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, no, go ahead.
Misha, would you also want to be able to route on 5G protocols like GTPC, GTPU, UFCP? Is that?
Yeah. So we what we currently do, we have L7 ingress CRDs for those. So we have SIP and GTP and PFCP. We're actually finishing PFCP, but NGAP, all the rest of those telco protocols. And at the moment with egress, we're just doing L4 treatment, so we don't do much with that, except for the protocols that specifically need to have ingress and egress together, like diameter. Again, for those of you who aren't into telco, this is, diameter is a peer-to-peer, and so you don't really have just one side reaching out to the other. You have it. So we set up our diameter path as both an ingress and an egress using a same CRD as a diameter agent. And we could look at doing, like, we could expand the idea of the routes so that you just use the same route, but you can use it for ingress and egress, or you could have completely separate egress routes from ingress routes. we do it completely separately in our product right now, but that's not necessarily the right way to do it for.
Right, having it applying in a symmetric manner can lead to potential holes being exposed. Like if you think that a rule is applicable to ingress and it, depending on the form of the rule, it catches an egress and does something you don't intend to do. Those kind of issues can be resolved by having them separate.
I mean,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, it's just,
No, go ahead. I'll
role of,
follow up after you.
it's just the role of ingress is to take some kind of traffic from the outside and direct it to, a service, right? And egress doesn't necessarily have a service, and egress isn't, you're not specifying, like in an egress route, you wouldn't be specifying where it goes to. You'd just be saying where it goes via, right? You'd be saying it goes via the gateway, not that it goes to a service like an ingress.
Yeah, that's fair. I wanted to just very briefly, I think this has done a good job of covering at least some of the use cases for L3, L4 kind of egress routing. We have a fair number of people on the call. I wanted to see if there are other implementations represented here that have been considering L7 egress routing. Because it will be helpful as we're developing this to not just think of a couple layers, but if we're also inevitably going to go to L7 to think holistically. John, it looks like you've been thinking about that with Istio.
Yep.
Console too.
Yep.
Is there any chance that we could see? There are a lot of different use cases in that document, which is pretty cool. It would be really interesting to see some more specifics on, I don't know, could we see something sketched out, including the CRDs that are currently in play and what sorts of policies are needed for that use case? The last time I did much stuff with telcos was 20 years ago. So thinking I'm a little bit out of date with, remembering a bunch of stuff going on there. I think that at least for me, it would be very helpful to see some more of the details on some of these things.
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, I think we're already we're kind of hoping that our transition to the Gateway API from our CRDs will help us kind of clean some things up. We have one big massive egress CRD, and it's got a lot of stuff in it. We've got a DNS NAT46 use case where we capture quad A records and put in a fake A record. We've got a whole bunch of use cases all kind of encapsulated in one single big CRD. And so it's, I'll say it's embarrassing, but it's not necessarily what we want it to be long term, but we could absolutely show it to you, sure.
Are there any of us in software who have stuff that's running that's what we want it to be long term? I mean, I don't think that happens, does it?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no, absolutely. And we can show you, we can show you the setup that we use for egress and how it integrates with our different, ingress stuff and how we configure our VLANs. And, we label each of our network domains. We call them VLANs, even though, they can be VLANs or verbs or whatever.
Bill,
yeah,
we can see almost like a generic middle box solution. I mean, this is where you're using Kubernetes as a service provider. It's providing 5G services. There's not an endpoint. It's going through and then going someplace else.
So okay, so that is an excellent question, because the way 5G is laid out is there are two parts to 5G. So there's sort of three parts to 5G. There's 5G radio,
At least,
and a lot of people are implementing 5G radio, and they don't need any of this stuff, right? They're just adding a new radio at the far end. And if you're using a phone and it pops up and says 5G, you're probably just getting 5G radio. Then there's the 5G core, which is broken apart into two parts. There's the user plane, which is the pass-through stuff you're talking about, where, you know, when you go to browse on your phone, it passes through there on the way to the internet. And then there's the control plane, where all the signaling happens to establish your mobility session, to establish your QoS for phone calls, to track the bytes you're using, all of that kind of control stuff, control how your text messages get sent through. Right now, we're focused mostly on that control plane stuff. And so it's not a pass-through. It is network function, talking to network function, talking to network function to try and establish a path for you, but the actual path happens separately.
So this is more of a service chain within the Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it service chaining.
Okay.
Service chaining kind of implies that you're taking the same information and kind of passing it through and doing different things to it. At least in 5G, in a lot of telco. But it's more like, you know, I want to look up information about the subscriber. Oh, then I want to tell this element that he's connecting. Then that element wants to tell somebody else, you know, find out from that person where, you know, what tower he's on. And then it sends it back, and then that allows the other guy to send something back to you. But it's all like call establishment, that kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. I do want to agree with what Shane dropped in chat there, that we are probably close to a time check. So what would be most helpful now is just figuring out what we should do next. One of the things that seems pretty clear to me is that this is a very good start, but that there are other use cases, especially when we're talking about different players that have not been covered. Maybe a question for Philip here. Would you prefer us to track those in a separate doc, or would you prefer for us just to overwhelm this doc with additional use cases?
I think I'd put a little line at the bottom after I was done typing. I think like I put a bunch of telco stuff. If somebody has something more to say about telco, add it up there. And if we've got other use cases that like I wasn't covering at all, something totally different or brand new, you know, put it below the line. I don't know. Does that sound
okay?
Good,
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think John and Mike both mentioned that they were interested in you know, L7 egress configuration. So maybe if we can start collecting some of the use cases for that, at least to start in this doc, and then we can go from there. And then, you know, I think the other thing that I saw mentioned in chat a lot is if there's some way to diagram this or give some more examples, I think that would go a really long ways. So maybe that's an action item for Philip if you've got time to illustrate this.
Even if the diagrams are, you know, a piece of it, showing one aspect of it rather than trying to do the whole overarching diagram of all of 5G.
Yep. No, I got to a point where it's like I could spend a long time adding extra stuff to this. I wanted to get it started. But yeah, I can absolutely. I know no document is worth anything without some diagrams, because it's hard for people to just picture from words. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think we've got pretty clear follow-ups then. Any action items I missed here? Cool. All right. Well, definitely. I'll keep on going.
Just at a high level, though, I'm going to add some diagrams. Other people can add things here about use cases that they see, and then we'll use that process to start distilling who's interested in actually working on this, right? And then we start defining what it would look like. Okay.
Yep. That sounds about right to me. Great. Well, yeah, thank you for starting this discussion. I know it's been on my mind for a while, just have not had the time to push it forward. So glad to glad to see this moving. And yeah, definitely we can follow up next week. Hopefully we'll get a bit more progress in between and see where we go from there. All right. Thank you again. The doc is linked in the agenda for anyone wanting to contribute or add more or just give it a more thorough read. But with that, let's move on to the next one, which is from Keith, some policy attachment feedback. I think I saw Keith on the call.
I see you, but I cannot hear you, Keith.
Maybe we'll come back. Yeah, we can come back. All right, Shane, if you're around, let's talk about 061 release.
Yeah, sounds good. Sorry in advance because I'm sick again, so I probably sound horrible. So Gateway API v061 is going to release this week, most likely tomorrow, and it's going to include predominantly updates for conformance tests. So just be on the lookout for that. From here on, you should probably start seeing faster releases, more releases, because we're going to try to do those at a more regular cadence.
Great.
Yeah, if there's no comments or anything about it. Thank you, Flynn. And then Blixt, which is a project that is being it is a implementation of Gateway API, which will be used for reference and testing in Gateway API, is about ready to get its first release. We are at the point where we have a basic level of support for UDP route that should at least make it possible to just start using it at a basic level, and that usage in Gateway API CI feedback into the changes that we need to make going forward until we're at a point where it covers a decent amount of conformance. There is a migration to Kubernetes SIGs that is underway that will block that. There's a link to it there, but basically it's been approved by Kubernetes SIGs, but we're waiting on CNCF approval because of the GPL2 license.
Great, thanks. Yeah, exciting to see a 0.1 release coming soon, and it will be great to have it in CI. One thing on the 061 release, I just want to make sure I remember this correctly. I think what we're doing is anything that is labeled in the 061 milestone. So if there's a PR that has the 061 milestone on it, we will do everything we can to make sure that is cherry picked back before we push the release. But if you see something that you really want to see included and doesn't have that milestone attached, definitely ping the, on Slack or on the PR, probably on Slack because the release is coming soon, and we'll make sure we can cherry pick.
Yeah, give me a ping tonight because I will likely be starting this kind of early in my morning and I'm Eastern time.
John?
Yeah, sorry, I missed a little bit of it, but is this the only project that's in the Gateway API CI?
This is the one that was meant to be neutral because it's based on Gateway API. It's only a Gateway API implementation on the control plane, and it's Linux kernel for the data plane using eBPF. So that is what we're going to start plugging into the CI to get started. It's not going to get us everything we want. As a matter of fact, it's not going to get us a whole lot day one, but it'll get us started on some of the basics, particularly things around like gateway, and then some of the statuses and stuff like that for route attachment can be done with layer 4 routes. We are talking about adding TLS route support for it in time. That's going to be interesting. And then at some point we would consider maybe starting to add something layer 7 to it that was just there so that we could do some testing but wouldn't actually be like a good implementation. We've talked about that too.
So I guess like I'm just a bit confused. What is the goal? Like if I add a new API feature, do I now have to go implement that in Blixt in order to get it merged? No.
The goal is that the conformance tests will actually run on PRs so that you're not as easily breaking things. Like if you make a change that touches well, anything that would suddenly be out of conformance right now today, we don't catch that. So with Blixt, we would in theory start catching those more often.
Right, but
and I
now if I
think-
want to actually change a conformance test, I have to go make sure that Blix actually supports that. Like if I
Yeah, I
add a
see
new
what you're
field and then I add a new test.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, that might be something that we need to do.
Yeah, I don't think that we've decided on the correct order of operations there, but that is a good point. I think one of the things that Blixt offers that is very important is right now we have a gap in terms of L4 implementations of the API. And Blixt allows us to kind of push forward with conformance tests and implementation quickly with that. But I agree that we have to be careful adding any prerequisites to new features. I'm not sure how
I
we'll
get
get.
like it's not clear why we need that in CI to do that. I mean, it's absolutely great that we have Blix and now we can test it against something, but why does that need to run in CI? We don't have a CI job for the L7, even though we have like 10 implementations of it.
Yeah, and
The
honestly,
specific case I'm trying to avoid is like, okay, add field and then I have to go modify this random project that I don't really care about, no offense, to add my field so that it passes test, whereas like, it becomes a bottleneck.
No, yeah, no, it's just interesting that this came up so many months later. I mean, we've been pretty clear about our intentions, so I guess we'll have to sit and kind of think about it some more with you. If that's going to be a problem, we'll have to talk about that and see what the solution is. I don't know if we need to hold up the meeting for it, but we can definitely go offline and say, what is a good compromise there? Is it really untenable for there to have to be some situations where you need to update that implementation? I can understand that.
So one of the things, just this is my own personal workflow, and I think we've talked about this earlier, is I think many of us when we're reviewing conformance tests will take the PR and manually run it against a few implementations to see how it does. It seems like it would be really nice to have some on-demand jobs available to do that for us. That is entirely possible, and I think that may be a good way to integrate Blixt here. But again, let's that this is, we can follow up. But I think
Yeah, I'm sure we can come up with some.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, I think we do need to follow up there. But let's go back. I think Keith, you're back online now. So maybe we can talk about policy attachment.
Yeah, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So when it comes to policy attachments, we were discussing this in Gamma last week, and we were talking about connection settings and things that mesh implementation might reach for policy attachment to represent, and it came up in that discussion that there seems to be a little bit of hesitation to use policy attachments for a couple of reasons. One of them on my end personally is CRD proliferation. To create a new policy of any sort, you commit to a new resource that is an part of your API that you have to maintain. And for especially a lot of meshes take flack for having too many CRDs. Now to be able to express policy, you have to add one for each kind of policy that you're wanting to represent, at least based on my reading of the existing documentation. The other one is kind of the hierarchy within policy attachment, the defaults and the overrides between the different resources. I think it works. I think it's great to have that expressed. It's really useful for a lot of use cases. But in mesh role, we're not using, at least at this point, gateway and gateway class and listener. There's fewer rungs, fewer levels of the hierarchy. And so that framework can kind of feel a bit heavy So that's, and I know there's been a lot of thought about meta resources, and Nick is working on that GEP. I've seen a couple of PRs in for that. But to kind of help put you in the mindset that we were in last week, one of the, we talked about connection settings on HTTP2, like window size, I believe, and some other things. Another example that came up on the opposite end of that, that's a little bit easier to imagine a user wanting to tweak, is timeouts. Timeouts are so hard to to get consistent across different data plane implementations. Totally get that. But as a particular mesh implementation, like with OSM, the idea of having to go, and if I want to represent timeouts to my if I want my users to be able to represent timeouts, I have to create a new CRD. And I have to version that, and I have to start thinking about defaults and overrides just to get the very first iteration of that feature in. So we just decided it would be a good idea to bring this up to the Monday meeting for general audience. Policy attachment is one of those things that hasn't been used a ton. It's not a really great usage of it in the wild, and that's one of the areas I've been hoping that that Gamma could do some exploration in. And this is kind of our early feedback, talking through the possibility of doing something real with it. So I wanted to know if anybody else had similar thoughts or concerns, and just kind of get some other feedback on our feedback.
Yeah, this is really good. I agree with much of what you're saying here. I completely understand the fear of just having too many CRDs, and CRDs are a pain to manage, both from implementation and user side. So I get it, and then I also get that policy attachment model today is wildly flexible, which is it meets many of the most advanced use cases, but also introduces lots of complexity to get there. So I get both of those. I think Nick's meta resource idea of, basically, at least the way I understand it, of just a resource that decorates or extends a single kind of resource, or, like one resource at a time without any kind of hierarchy, is very interesting. That probably works well for a lot of use cases. So that's definitely a good directional thing. I also want to highlight some discussion that's happened, at least in Envoy land. I know not every mesh implementation, not every ingress implementation is Envoy based, but a lot are. And so if you happen to have, like timeout is a great example, that everyone, the reason these things aren't, something we can put in Gateway API is because we have lots of underlying implementations. But if you happen to be somebody who is, just finding a different way to express the same Envoy configuration, then at the very least, maybe we can share configuration across Envoy-based implementations of the API.
Or even potentially non-Envoy based implementations of the API where there is some commonality in semantics.
Yes.
Right? A request timeout might be something that's expressible in a lot of different implementations, Envoy or not.
I
know it's way harder than that. I'm just picking that one specific example as a place where maybe the majority of them could do something that's similar to each other, right?
No, I thought timeout would be so easy to express, and then I dug into it and looked. I was comparing Nginx, Envoy, and HA Proxy at the time, and there's almost no overlap in terms of the configurable timeouts. If you actually read the very specific details of what each timeout means,
it's a thing that I would like to spend some time on, looking at the existing implementations, and I have not had a chance to do that yet.
Bowie?
Yeah, so I think the one question would be, we did go through this exercise, so what would, I'm assuming that, it is possible that you come to a different conclusion, but what is different this time? That's something that comes to mind in terms of evaluating, for example, something like timeouts and abstracting them.
I think I think our feedback isn't so much that timeout should be a part of HTTP route. It's that, and I mentioned this in the meeting last week, for the game meeting rather. I feel myself reaching for something lighter than policy attachment, but not as I guess final or general as HTTP route or any X route in the family. Like Rob, you mentioned, like Nick's meta resource is very intriguing to me, that perhaps there is, maybe we're starting to talk about something that's a concrete example of a meta resource that's not policy attachment, that solves a little bit smaller use case. Because again, from Mesh World, there's a lot that we want to express that we know probably is not going to be in the core API. Well, core is overloaded, but the main HTTP route like API. But we want to be able to get stuff out there for users to configure these use cases, and we're trying to find a spot to put that. Does that help?
I think one of the other things that came out of the Gamma meeting, and Keith, correct me if you think I'm misstating here. There are ways in which the mesh case, since it leans on such different things than the Ingress case, Ingress, almost by definition, you really need a lot of flexibility. There's a larger feature set. In a lot of ways, the mesh implementations really should be things where a lot of what you want should be a surface area where the user does not have to configure it, where the defaults make sense, but you occasionally want to tweak something. And so they end up feeling pretty different. And a lot of us ended up kind of feeling like, yeah, simplicity is really good, and we would like to find something that does not need the complexity of policy attachment. And again, there are several, I see several faces here that were there in the Gamma meeting. So you think I overstated there, then sing out.
Dave, I think you're up next.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention, I hear a lot of like, these implementations don't do X, or they're so widely different. I think a good perspective is to think of end users, what is beneficial to them, and potentially like, maybe they are different, unique, but you're also setting a standard as part of the working group. And if you can say 80% of the use cases are addressed by the standard, then you could probably create, for example, timeout fields, retry fields, like as generic policy. Put it in like, I guess, extended conformance until these other implementations catch up, right? And then what's great for me as an end user is then we have portability. Like I can have one app deployed here and use this implementation when I transition to some other distribution or implementation. Like these definitions for my timeouts and retries will just continue working, because I know like this group has set the standard, and implementations will like change the functionality to fit that standard. You know what I mean?
I would give that more than 2 thumbs up if I had more than 2 thumbs.
Yeah, like I wouldn't just survey what people have done for like implementations, but try to skew this, maybe the API towards what users need and want, right?
Yeah, and from the user's perspective, the concept of a request timeout is pretty easy for a user to understand, right? Just to pick on that one again for a second.
Yep, that makes sense. I do want to time box this, but I'll let Mike go next, and then maybe we can keep on moving.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Just +1 on like the policy attachment feels overly complex. Like even putting aside the issue of like CRD proliferation, it's a deep, very nested CRD or pattern for a CRD itself, which feels like a lot for a user to comprehend in order to make a relatively simple change for like business logic of one application. So yeah, just +1 on like, it's powerful. It is very useful in certain use cases, but a lot of our common cases are actually much simpler and might benefit from a simpler UX.
Yeah,
And
that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's before even getting into like, could we possibly consolidate some of these? Like, even if we have to do our own, like just having them smaller would be better.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe we need some, I'm trying to think of the best way to follow up here, because this is a much bigger topic than we have time for in today's meeting. Maybe we need a follow-up meeting focused more on this. In the meantime, it might help to start, the thing that this seems like to me is a discussion on GitHub. With some of the limitations of the API or the model, I guess, and maybe we can go from there. But this is a big topic, and yeah, I don't have any clear action items. Open to other ideas here before we move on.
I kind of like the action item of starting a GitHub discussion, actually.
So I do have one question. Is this 2 issues? One about complexity of policy attachment and another about specific policies that may have to be generalized, or do you see this as one thing?
Yeah, that's
really,
yeah, that's a good distinction. I think that at a minimum now, yeah, policy attachment is complex, is an issue or discussion. The second one, we have started some discussion around timeouts as a rough example. Timeouts keep, every time policy attachment comes up, timeouts come up. So, that's probably
There's a
worth a
reason for that,
discussion
right?
on its own. And, maybe if somebody is willing to start those 2 discussions, can we have any volunteers for that before we move on?
I can create the issue for policy attachment, or the discussion on policy attachment.
I'm not sure if I can create those. So.
Oh, anybody can. There's nothing fancy. Yeah. So.
Yeah. All right. I can create the one about
timeouts.
I guess I'll create one about timeouts specifically, and then maybe go from there into
great.
Other things we could consider generalizing.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate raising this topic, and yeah, hopefully more discussion async offline. I've lost track, but we went up to Keith. I think we're back down to the reference grant KEP. Hopefully I didn't miss anything along the way. I just wanted to highlight this. We are proposing moving reference grant upstream. So SIG Auth would take ownership. It is merged as provisional, but there were a number of unresolved issues that the linked PR attempts to resolve. And I wanted to highlight those because they, I'd say the group of Gateway API implementers are probably most familiar with reference grant, and we're getting some suggestions to make, changes. Some are fairly significant to reference grant. One is giving up on status in reference grant. I don't think anyone will be too upset about that. We never had status, we just left room for it. Then we're moving kind, renaming it to resource and using the resource terminology, which usually just means lowercase and plural as opposed to kind. That is a more precise way to reference resources, which is preferred when the resource can reference any number of indeterminate kinds of resources. Then there has been a suggestion, we'll see where it goes, to add verbs. The idea being that a verb would allow you to describe the purpose you're allowing a reference to exist for. So right now we have a concept of in Gateway API, you can allow access to TLS certs or to forward traffic, right? And so if you had a verb to describe, I'm allowing access to this secret to pull a TLS cert out, or I'm allowing access to this service to forward traffic, but nothing else. You know, I don't know. The idea of verbs actually enables some other pretty interesting use cases, because if you very clearly specified the purpose for the reference, you can loosen up some other restrictions. And then finally, the most significant change of them all, I would say, would be opening up room to namespace label selectors. So the idea that you could allow references from any namespace or a set of namespaces with specific labels. Big changes. If you have opinions on these, it is still, you know, although we're transitioning this resource away from us and towards SIG Auth, I'm sure any feedback from reference grant from people that have implemented this already or have used it would be very welcome on this KEP. Yeah, so Dave, I think you're up.
A quick question. Was the status removed because there was no use for it right now, or was it just
basically yes? Tried to make an argument for keeping it, and at high level, there were the concern was if we had it, who would populate it and how would it scale? Basically, if there's an indeterminate number of implementations that are populating this, how do we know that, you know, a reference grant can hold that? You know, what is the limit? And then what value does it provide over, say, a separate resource that, so one of the alternatives proposed was a reference granted resource, but basically a resource that tracks this reference grant has been used to grant these forms of access by this implementation,
okay.
which
I guess
results in a lot more resources, but it is less noisy in the sense that every implementation watching a reference grant doesn't get bombarded with updates.
And I guess my other question is, the gateway APIs will switch to this new type in what, V1? Like a V1 API?
Unclear. We're going to have reference grant as part of the reference grant included in Gateway API for some time, because at best, this reference grant resource will make it into 127. That would have to happen this week. I'm not sure that the PR I've linked will actually get in this week. If it doesn't, it's not till 128. So we'll have to have the CRD in Gateway API for a fairly long period of time.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Mike?
Yeah, just minor point of feedback in terms of trying to keep the UX of reference grants simple. Reference grants have consistently been one of the biggest stumbling blocks for our users adopting console API Gateway and Gateway API. It's a thing that almost always gets forgotten, and then they're looking at status and why doesn't this work, and oh, I need to learn this thing. And maybe having it become more common in other parts of the Cube ecosystem will help with that. But definitely, like, is color my initial reaction towards let's try to avoid overcomplicating the resource that is already tripping people up to begin with.
Yeah, that is very helpful. And, you know, I think many of these things are not necessarily you know, that the first two are not overcomplicating, but I would agree that verbs and namespace label selectors both have the potential to overcomplicate. So feedback.
I have a question on the removing the space for status. Is the proposal to uplift the spec, basically remove any possibility of status, or
yeah,
I see. So there's like no possibility if later we wanted to add it, we could add it.
Yeah, that's so the reason we so in Gateway API reference grant, we have spec and no status with the idea that it would at least leave room for status. We got some pushback when we tried that, but we, we might want it.
Yeah, that's
And now
always dangerous.
Yeah. And now the thing is, well, okay, you've had it for a year plus and you still haven't done anything with it. So, will it ever? Yeah. So, and this is also SIG where resources traditionally don't have status. So I think it's fine to remove it or remove any possibility of it. With that, there's a lot more discussion available on there, and actually probably the PR before that. There's lots of bits that link back to the previous PR that have more discussion on it right now. But if you have comments, definitely add them there. Would be helpful. But yes, we are way past time check here. So I do want to just very quickly run through, I guess, one more thing, and that is this one here. Thank you, Shane, for adding this. This is a comment that got lost on an old PR, but at some point we need to probably transition this to an issue. I can do that after this meeting, actually, but we need to define what it means to have multiple references to TLS certs in Kubernetes secrets. And then, okay, sorry, one last thing. I am really looking for, I commented on the path redirect and rewrite gap issue. I'm looking for one more implementation that has implemented this. Right now we know that Envoy Gateway and Istio have implemented this. If we can find just one more implementation that has implemented this feature, I think we'll be good to move it forward. But we do need probably one more implementation. So I mentioned a few people here, but if you're on the call, if you're familiar with an implementation that's supporting this today, please comment on this issue. Would love to move this one forward. But yes, we are past time. So thank you, everyone, for great discussion today. We missed some things. We'll push them on to next week. But thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.
See you.
Thanks. Have a good night.